Hey, Brooke. Hey, Bowling.
Hey.
Hey. So, do we have anything in particular we're talking about this episode?
Yeah, normally you give us an agenda. You didn't give us much to go on today.
Well, I have a new segment that I really want to reveal, but outside of that, I don't know. I'm really not feeling it this week.
What's up? Something wrong?
I don't know. I feel like our podcast needs something.
Something? And what do you mean?
I don't know, really. I want to somehow make this a more Christian podcast, you know?
More Christian?
How can we be more Christian?
Well, I've thought a bit about this, and I really see no other way to give us a more Christian voice.
Okay, you're doing this on purpose. You're just trying to tease us. What is it?
You have an idea. Spill the beans, Stacy.
Drum roll, please.
Oh, you're not joking, are you?
You seriously want a drum roll?
I'm waiting on my drum roll, yes.
Just give him the drum roll. Just give him the drum roll.
This week, the only way that I believe we can make this a more Christian podcast is...
Let me guess. Christian Taylor's going to be our guest, and you've been playing her name off as a pun.
Dang it, Brooke. You've ruined the big reveal.
I got it right.
Wow, seriously?
Hey, guys.
Hey,
Hey, Christian.
Hey, Christian.
Hey, I hear you guys need help making this a little bit more of a Christian podcast.
We sure can.
Yeah, this is really cool. Welcome, Christian.
Yay,
Thank you very
much.
much.
Welcome to the show, Christian.
Thank you. So, all right, well, how does this work? What do we start the show off with?
Well, this week you're in luck. We're starting a new segment. It's something you're probably familiar with.
Well, what is that?
Drum roll, please.
Yeah, you're not getting another drum roll out of me. Just go ahead and tell us.
Okay. It's called News of the Rump.
No, I am sorry about this. I am out.
What just happened?
Stacy, what'd you do?
What did you do? You ruined our Christian voice.
Christian, come back.
Do life's greatest questions seem like a mystery? Well, we're probably going to talk about it here at Appalachian Liturgy. Important questions like, are you a Jedi or an Imperial? Is oatmeal actually a breakfast cereal? Is a Catholic weekday really called a ferial? Did you know that Mr. Rogers was Presbyterial? So join us as we have a little fun talking about thy kingdom come. Appalachian Liturgy.
Okay. Welcome to the Appalachian Liturgy Podcast. I am Justin Stacy.
I'm Reverend Brooke Ashley.
And I'm Justin Bowling.
And today we are honored to have our guest, Christian Taylor. She's a voice actress, co-host of the Holy Post podcast and the Documentary First podcast. She's also a producer, director of The Girl Who Wore Freedom. Welcome, Christian, to the show.
I am. Thank you very much. I think you covered it all, except for the fact that I've been married 28 years. I have 4 boys, and I live in Wheaton, Illinois, currently.
Very good.
I didn't realize you were my counterpart. I have 4 girls.
Oh, how about that? You lost, I guess.
Yes.
My husband would say he won, and I came from a family of 4 girls, so I did clearly lose that boy-girl battle.
That's
Wow.
awesome, though.
That's great.
I will tell you, Justin, oh, wait, who said that? Is that Justin? Yeah, Justin. Yeah. There's 2 Justins. How am I going to keep you straight?
So I'm Stacy and he's Bowling.
Bowling. Okay. So that helps. So my dad, I can remember sitting at our, Sunday evening lunch table, and we would be talking about girl things. This is right around, our teenage years. And my dad would just take his plate and he would get up and go and eat in the kitchen.
I fully expect that. Yeah.
Yeah. You have some fun days ahead of you, I got to tell you.
Good stuff. All right, Christian. So today we wanted to bring you on and really just get get to know you better, and you get to know us better, I guess.
Yeah.
So I know you've mentioned before on the Holy Post that you grew up in the South, grew up in Mississippi. So take us down memory lane to Mississippi and your I guess your Christian history with your family and what church you went to, and I'd like to know about your school as well.
Okay, sure. I love talking about that stuff because all of us Mississippians believe that the world does revolve and should revolve around Mississippi. So I love talking about my younger days. It was a great place to grow up. But I have a question for you before I dive into that. And that is, do your listeners know what the Holy Post is?
Probably not, and that's definitely a question I was going to get to. But go ahead and explain
Tell us.
for us.
Okay, well, so the reason that you guys know me, like you said, is because you've heard me on the Holy Post podcast. And the Holy Post podcast is a podcast that I've been on for about 9 years with Phil Vischer, who's the creator of VeggieTales and What's in the Bible, and most recently some pretty controversial videos on race in America and abortion and the history of evangelicalism in America. And so we've been doing this podcast for a long time. It started because Phil was in the middle of doing What's in the Bible, and I think he needed a little bit of a break, was getting a little bored, and he wanted to do a TV talk show, like, a la Stephen Colbert. And he came and he knew I was doing a lot of production work. So he came to ask me if I would produce this. And my standard answer is, well, of course. And I had no idea how to do that, but I always figure I can figure it out. It can't be that hard. So we did. We set out to produce 4 episodes of this TV talk show called The Phil Vischer Show. And we did that. And Eric Metaxas was our first guest. And we had, a few others that came on. Darren Streblow, I think, was one of them. And I can't even remember. But Phil has this penchant for saying things he probably shouldn't, or saying them without thinking. And it started to worry the people that were paying for What's in the Bible. And so they basically took those episodes and stuck them on the shelf and weren't really going to pay for us to do anymore. So I said, well, we could do a podcast. It doesn't cost anything. And so we started, and I think our first guest was Oz Guinness. So that was about 9 years ago in the spring. And we've been doing that ever since. The other co-host is Skye Jethani. He was our pastor at one time and an editor of Christianity Today. And then he wrote the book with Futureville, What's Wrong with Religion, What If Jesus Was Serious. He writes the With God Daily devotional. He's an incredible human. His brain is unlike anything I've ever experienced before. He knows history, religion, politics, culture. It's just crazy. So we have a lot of really good discussions. I happen to be the everyman on that podcast, where most of the time I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? And why should I care? And so, we did our little intro in the beginning. And so News of the Rump is a play on News of the Butt, which it's a segment that Phil does on our podcast, which I honestly am like, why are we doing this? I thought we were supposed to be focusing on Christians and culture. This is ridiculous, which is exactly why Phil does it. And we had somebody comment to us this week who said, I'm so thankful for the beginning of the podcast where I can just laugh, because the 3 of us usually talk about culture and what's happening in the news, and Phil finds these funny news stories, and it does they're super funny. So, and it is pretty light, because the second half of the show, we interview writers, and they're talking a lot about cultural, political, and religious issues of the day. So yeah, there's the Holy Post in a nutshell.
Yeah, and
so you all started it 9 years ago?
Yeah, long time. But it was the Phil Vischer podcast to begin with. Yep. So I do think you can still find the Phil Vischer podcast on all the podcast things. And then at some point, things morphed. And I think it's because Phil got really busy doing some Mr. Phil TV or some devotional things for Right Now Media. And so it was really hard for him to do the podcast as much. So he kind of passed all the interview stuff over to Skye, and they divided it in half, and they rebranded it, and it became the Holy Post. And so now, for the most part, Skye does the interviews. Phil sometimes will step in. And more recently, he's been more activated politically and socially and more vocal on, social media networks. I think the Race in America video really kind of took him by surprise, because I love the man to death, but he is still in the 1990s, or he's starting to catch up, where you make these half an hour VeggieTale shows and you make them into DVDs, and then you get them on TV, and maybe you make a movie, and it goes out through distribution channels. And so he's just been really trying to figure out, how do you make money now in the way that this whole entertainment, thing has changed. And we've talked to him about that for a long time. Like, Phil, you really need to do these videos and put them out for free. And he's like, I can't do that. But he did that because he had a bee in his bonnet. He did this video, and it was just as elaborate as any other video he did. I mean, it had, all the good graphics and all the great stats and just all this stuff. It took him a lot of time. But I mean, like in a day, he had 45,000 views, and he was like, huh. And our podcast numbers went up. And we've had, then advertisers who are willing to pay for sponsorships, right? Or people that were willing to join Patreon. So he's starting to get his mind around this whole new way of things. And it's been interesting to watch and fun to be part of that podcast. I've learned a ton, which brings us, now into sort of my story and background. The podcast has been revolutionary for me, personally, professionally, politically, because I've just learned so much from Phil and Skye. And like you said, I came from Mississippi. I was born in Laurel, Mississippi, which is the southeast corner. It's Jones County. So if you've ever seen or heard about the movie The Free State of Jones, that was my county. And while that movie talks about them being different than the rest of Mississippi, the reality that I grew up in was that it was very typical of the South in terms of the makeup racially and of the just the whole divide. In fact, I lived on a street probably 6 or 7 houses away from the head of the Ku Klux Klan in the 60s and early 70s, Sam Bowers. And he went to my church. So I definitely grew up in the heart of the Deep South. I was born in 1966. So I remember vividly the first time I went to our local swimming pool. And at that time, I think I was around 6 or 7. And I saw the first brown person in our swimming pool. And I'll never forget it because I thought somebody was dirty in there. It was so shocking. I just remember thinking, what is that brown person doing in there? And it was only one brown person. And as I got older into middle school, they still had colored and white on the bathrooms. I remember seeing them at the football field, the local high school football field, and wondering why those were there. So I wasn't really aware growing up of any of that, obviously. But as I got older, things became more clear. And interestingly enough, in this little town of Laurel, Mississippi, now it's a super famous town because it is where Hometown is filmed. And Hometown is the HGTV show. And that started actually by Aaron and Ben. And Aaron and her mom worked for my dad in his real estate business. So we've been friends with them for a really long time. And they actually did what I was hoping to do, which was figure out a way to revitalize this downtown that had been decimated by white flight. And so they've come back in there and are rehabbing and trying to get people to come there. And that's what's happened now. People are coming from all over the world to try to live in this tiny little town of Laurel, Mississippi. It originally started when New York, very wealthy New Yorkers, socialites, came down there and saw all the pine and the timber and realized they could make a lot of money. So they set up masonite. And masonite, I think you actually have some of that masonite paneling on the back of your wall, Justin. Yeah. And so that comes from my hometown of Laurel, Mississippi. And interestingly enough, my grandparents and great-grandparents on one side of the family, they were the surveyors of Laurel, Mississippi. And on the other side, they worked in this logging camp. And my grandmother's father was one of the owners and people that ran this logging camp. And so my grandmother would end up playing in the kitchen with the cook's daughter. The cook was Marguerite Chandler. And so my grandmother and Marguerite Chandler, who was Black, grew up in this little logging camp together. And as my grandmother got older and once she got married and had a child, she had Marguerite come and work with her in her home as the help. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Help.
Yes.
But that really was my life to a T, honestly. And the Marguerite then raised my dad and his brother and cleaned the house. And then when my dad had me, they handed me right to Marguerite. And so Marguerite took care of me and my sisters, cleaned our house. And so I grew up with Marguerite caring for me from the time that I was a little girl. So for me, my parents were not overtly racist. I don't remember them saying negative things or being ugly or mean or even being aware that there was any racial divide as I was growing up. So I sort of lived blissfully unaware of the tensions that were boiling in my little town. And then to take you back spiritually, I'm going to sort of like put that on the shelf for a minute. My parents, when they met and married, they met at Ole Miss, which is the University of Mississippi. And my dad was a senior, my mother was a freshman, and they met bowling at like a, I don't know, fraternity bowling party or something like that in April. And they decided to get married, and they were married in August. So they didn't know each other that long. And both of them were pretty, hard living. My dad had grown up in a Christian family that went to a Baptist church in our town. My mom, not so much. Her family, were Christians, but not really. And so when my parents got married, they were really pretty lost. And my mom was 19 and my dad was 23. And so they moved to where my dad was from, Laurel, Mississippi, and my dad went to work in his real estate business. And when I was born about 18 months after they got married, something like that. I was super little. My mom was only 20. And my parents started going to the First Baptist Church in my hometown. And the pastor of that church was Dr. Bob Marsh. And he was unbelievable. I mean, and to this day still is. He lived in Atlanta. He was one of the pastors of Peachtree Baptist Church and is still teaching there. But he saw my parents coming to church, and he put them in charge of the high school youth group, really before they were really Christians. And so my parents were running this high school youth group, and Dr. Marsh led my parents to the Lord. And so as a little girl, I remember going along with all these high schoolers, we'd go skiing, we'd go ice skating in New Orleans at the Lakeside Mall. We would go to Dolphin Island. We would go to Ship Island. We would do all these things together with the youth group. Lake Forest Ranch was the Christian camp that I went to growing up. And I was just in the midst of this incredible Christian teaching under Dr. Marsh, and like all these Bill Gothard and Josh McDowell and all these, Billy Graham came to our town. All of these people came to our town because Dr. Marsh brought them in during the early 70s. My parents went to Explo 72 in Dallas. Like, these are things you should look up because they are like cultural Christian history. And they were formative of who I was as a child. And I remember my mom kneeling with my mom at 3 by my bed and asking Jesus to come into my heart.
Wow.
And, kids at 3 don't know what that is, but I remember it. And I do believe that my mom planted that seed of who Christ was in my little heart. And I would go to Girls in Action, and I would go to Sunday school. Yeah. I would do Bible sword drills, and, all of those things sort of taught me how to read my Bible and how to be kind to others. And I think the real next level growth in my life was going to Lake Forest Ranch. And it was a Christian camp that I would go to every summer, and they would have powerful teachers that came, and I did worship by the lake every day. And I remember sitting on a pier one day asking God if he was real, and if he was real, would he make something happen? And fish jumped out of the water. I mean, this is a silly story, but it's really true. And we would have to have quiet times every day for half an hour. And I would sit and read my Bible and talk to God. And so that was when I was 10, 11, 12, 13. So, for any parents that are out there listening who have young children, you may not think that what you're doing or what you're saying, they're ever going to remember. But I think that little story right there lets you know that it's planted in their DNA of who they are. And I really do believe that if you raise them up the way that they should go, they will at some point return to that truth if they know.
Yeah. So a similar story. My grandmother, she taught me when I was probably 4 or 5 years old how to pray. She taught me some of the little Bible songs, Bible, that's the book for me, that type of thing. And she would
I am
record
a C, I am a CH, I am a CHRSTIN. Remember that one?
Exactly. Yep, I sure do.
Going faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I thought it was all my song,
Yeah. But she would record it on these tape recorders and let me listen. And I probably have the tape somewhere. Mom does, at least. And so that planted the seed for me. And I didn't grow up in church, but I had that little piece. And then when my grandmother died, when I was 15 years old, that motivated me to get in church. That one event did.
Wow.
So,
isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the other two of you? Does your audience already know this?
Probably not.
We talked about some about that in episode 0, but probably not all of it.
Yeah. So, I grew up in the church, and as we got older teens, the church we were a part of kind of had a split. And my sister, who is just this kind of crazy to think of, she and her boyfriend started looking for a church and found this tiny little Methodist church just down the street. And we started going there. And I was in college, and I had a relationship fall apart, a relationship that I'd been in for years. I thought I was going to marry this guy and all this kind of stuff. So it fell apart. And so I had decided I was going to do one of two things that summer. I was either going to join the Army and be in the ROTC, or I was going to be a Christian camp counselor at Buffalo Mountain Camp. And so thankfully, I got hired on at Buffalo Mountain Camp, and not the Army. So met my now husband, and we kind of did like your parents. We met in May and were married in January the next year. And he and I've been in ministry ever since. But really that summer at camp, when I was responsible for kids and their parents had sent them, I really had to wrestle with, is this my faith, or is this my parents' faith, or is this somebody else's faith? So that was just a launching point for me. So I'm a huge proponent of Christian camps, not just for the kids, but for the college age students that are devoting their time and just that summer where they're focusing on where they're going in their relationship with God. So
yeah, that whole dynamic of teaching those that are younger than you, when you only have a little bit of knowledge or understanding or information or even time walking with the Lord, forces you to dive deeper, makes you to feel more responsible, challenges you to be better than you are. And so, I just think I agree with you. I think when you dive in as a college kid to go beyond yourself and help others, it certainly does, force you to change and to grow and to rethink.
Yeah. And I think back on that. So I was 19 or 20, I can't remember. And right after camp is when all of the churches that wanted youth and children's directors, like they were like vultures on camp counselors, like they would come and just pluck you up. And so at 19 and 20, I was leading youth groups and taking them on cross-country mission trips. Like I think back on that now and I'm like, they were crazy to let me do that. Like I knew nothing about what I was doing, but there was that responsibility, and it forced me to just dive really deep. So
yeah. What about you, Stacy? Bowling.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually very, very similar to yours. A lot of the stuff you were saying was stuff that kind of, brought back memories. Sword drill. You talked about like the Josh McDowell stuff, and you talk about the Explo stuff that reminded me of like Winterfest that we would always go to with youth in Gatlinburg every year. Mm-hmm. But yeah, very similar on that type of stuff. I still remember like the nightly prayers that I would say with my parents every night from when I was like 3 or 4 type thing. That was still like, it can roll off my tongue, just real quick. Yeah. And similar to what Brooke was saying, I kind of went through church all through my teenage years, but my church had a split about the end of my high school years. And that kind of, motivated me to figure out what I believed and why I believed type of stuff, and, really deepen my relationship with Christ after that.
Yeah, that's just so awesome. It is interesting hearing people's journeys, of faith.
So the other thing that struck me when you were first talking about the talk show that you're doing, Phil Vischer, and you said that you had Os Guinness on as a guest, and I was like, oh my gosh. So I was fangirling a little bit. Because
you think you were fangirling. I was with him in person. Like, I just couldn't believe it.
His book, The Call, was mandatory reading for first semester seminary students at the seminary that I attended. And I'll have to admit, I absolutely hated that book while they were making us read it. Like it was one of those things that, I complained every single time I picked it up. I can't believe, but what I will have to say about that is I have gone back to that book time and time again in ministry, reminding myself of what my primary call is. And I use the language that he used, the primary and secondary call, now in mentoring other people coming into ministry, mentoring people as they discern what God is doing for them. And so it's one of those things where at the time, and I think the reason I hated it so much when I was reading it was that it was so convicting for me that I kept getting my primary and secondary calls reversed, and I was focusing on being in ministry instead of being a follower of Jesus Christ. And so it was a very convicting thing. So I was like, oh my gosh. So those were two like really pivotal points, I think, in my faith development personally.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I have experienced some of that myself all the way along, and particularly with the Holy Post, because when you're growing up, it's so safe to be in some sort of framework that gives you rules to live by, right? So I grew up in the Baptist church, and these in Mississippi, and these are the do's and the don't. You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't have sex. It's all focused on behavior, right? And you don't lie, and you're a kind, good person. You're all of these things. And interestingly enough, I had that going on, but because I was in this church that I really do believe was baptized by the Holy Spirit, there was something special going on during this time. And everybody that went to that church at that time, and that was in my parents' youth group, everybody says in their whole life, there was something really special about what was going on during that time. And I could tell the difference between that and sort of the religion and the behaviors. And it is unsettling when you are challenged to think outside of those comfort guardrails of, rules from the church or behavior do's and don'ts. And I've had to redefine who I am over the last, I would say, 20 years, and how I thought about myself. When I met my husband 28 years ago, the first night I met him, I said, I am a Christian and I'm a Republican, and I will not date you if you are not.
That's awesome.
And I mean, I was like, and I'm not sleeping with you. And I just kind of laid it all out on the line about who I was. And, interestingly enough, I just did not realize how steeped I was in the stew of my past and all of those things that hemmed me in. And as those began to kind of crumble around me, or I was challenged, my husband was a Navy brat and he lived all over the place and he was raised Catholic. And when we met, he wasn't really even a Christian in the sense of a person having a personal relationship with Christ. And so, and he was he's a lawyer and he's very just. My husband is, I would say, excellent judge, because he's just such a just man. And he would always challenge me. I'll never forget. This was when we were first married. We were living in Oxford, Mississippi, and we were trying to decide who to vote for governor. And there was this Democrat who was a pretty upstanding guy. And then there was this Republican who was a scumbag, like done illegal things. And he really wasn't a good guy. And my husband made a point of being like, you're going to vote for him, aren't you? Just because he's a Republican, you're not able to. And I never voted for a Democrat until 2016. I wasn't ever even able to do that, to think outside the box. I thought that Democrats couldn't be Christians. I thought when I grew up, you were not a Christian if you went to the Catholic Church.
Yep.
You were Catholic, right? And so there were just all these things that I grew up with that I didn't even realize were in my operating system.
What you're saying makes me think of like the line from, St. Paul when he's saying like, when you were children, you were given milk and like type thing, and you have to grow up to adult food. And it's like we get used to that comfort of the stuff that we grew up with, or that we and don't want to have to challenge ourselves. Like, whenever something convicts us or wants us to change, it's uncomfortable and we don't like it. So it really takes us like something to jolt us out of that. It's hard and it's easy to kind of stay with the same routines that we've had in the past. And I definitely can relate to the stuff you're saying.
Well, and it's work. So like one of the things that drives me crazy when I'm talking to Skye Jethani, I always want him to give me an answer. Like, what's right to do? What's wrong to do? What does this mean? What does that mean? And inevitably, like we just did 3 Christian Asks, which are these little segments that are podcast, editions for our Patreon subscribers, where I will ask Skye questions and we discuss those. Inevitably, the answer is that's complicated. That's complicated. There is a tension of this and that. The Bible is full of paradoxes, and you cannot boil it down to a formula. But that is hard, because you know what it means? It means that we have to be closely connected to who Jesus Christ is, and we have to understand how he leads our thinking and our development through the Spirit. And we have to be open to him speaking to us about each individual issue. And that means keeping our connection to Christ ever present. That is hard work. It's a lot easier to believe a framework or follow a church or a politician or whatever.
And people don't like to be uncomfortable or struggle. Right. And really, we're getting ready to launch a brand new small group ministry in the midst of a pandemic, y'all. It's crazy. But it starts next week. And one of the things that we've talked about over and over with the folks that have agreed to do this is you are going to be uncomfortable. And it is okay to be uncomfortable, because that is where you're going to grow. And that we don't, you don't just follow Jesus and have all the answers. And you have to struggle with that. And sometimes the answers that you think you have now are going to change as you become closer like Christ. I mean, it's just going to happen. And people become very scared when they're in that struggle. And then when they realize that, well, maybe I wasn't always right about this, then they start questioning everything else. But it's a process that is important that we do.
For sure.
I think what really shook me to my core in my religious experience happened over the past decade. And honestly, I think I credit Justin Bowling for this. He is really the first Catholic that I've ever known. And when we started our small group discussions on every biblical topic you can think of, I started realizing that my evangelical background of interpretation is completely, well, not completely different, but it is different from other denominations, and I have to deal with that now. And because I was naive and I thought everybody just believed the Bible is, the plain reading and the way I believed it. And I consider myself open-minded. I think I've always been open-minded. I was raised Democrat, so I even had the paradox of being somewhat of a fundamental Christian who believes in young Earth and all this stuff, but still voting Democrat because I was raised that way. It was weird. It was a weird paradox. Yeah. But I had to wrestle a lot, and I had to change. I didn't have to change, but I did change my views, and it just helped me grow spiritually. And I definitely credit. I give Justin Bowling credit as being my spiritual mentor, because I went just basically from. Yeah, you did. I went from, and I even changed multiple denominations during this time too. I went from. When I was in high school, I was Church of Christ, and then when I got married, I went to Presbyterian, and I've done a few Presbyterian churches during that time. I then went to a contemporary non-denominational, tried that, and now I'm in an Episcopal church, and so I'm more liturgical now, and I think it's because of the Catholic, changing my mind on things. I just haven't made the jump to Catholic.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you bring that up. I think one of the most wonderful blessings in my life, which is so funny to say now, but in this growing up time, I was in Mississippi when they desegregated the schools, and I was in 7th grade. And so think about this. The civil rights movement was 1965. Is that right? I get those years all mixed up, but it wasn't until 79 that busing was started in my hometown. And so I remember that time period vividly, because my mom was so afraid for my sister to go to school across the tracks. I didn't even know what that meant, but I just remember her being panicked and all the other mothers being upset about it. And I was at the middle school that merged, and, our population was, over half Black. And during that time, I was so thankful to be on the girls' basketball team, because I was the only white girl, and all of the Black girls protected me from 2 other white girls that beat me up every day. And they became my family. It was the most wonderful, wonderful blessing.
That almost sounds like a future Disney movie.
Yeah. Yeah. You might have an idea there. It was wonderful, because I really, again, my parents weren't overtly prejudiced, and I had this wonderful upbringing with Marguerite Chandler. And now I had this family of Black girls that protected me from my own people. And so that was a wonderful experience for me of getting to know this other culture, right, that I didn't know. But then I also started dating a boy, and this boy in Mississippi, I don't know if they have this in Tennessee or Virginia or whatever, but in my hometown, the boys would stay back so that they could be bigger for football, so they could play college football, so they could be professional football players. That was everybody's dream. So this one boy, David Wright, he had stayed back like 2 years, I think. He was in school in 9th grade, but probably should be in 11th. And he drove, and somehow we started dating. And my mother was trying to control my behavior. So she wanted me to wear a dress to school every day. And I was like, whatever. And I would put my jeans on underneath my dress, and I would get to the bus stop, and I would take off the dress. And then David would fly up in his blue Monte Carlo. I would get in, and we would drive to school. Well, one day we got stopped by a policeman because he was speeding. He used to just fly. And I know it was that policeman that ratted on me, because the next day, David flies by my bus stop and doesn't stop. And I'm like, what is going on here? And I see my dad's Cherokee Chief flying after him to go to school. And I'm like, oh no. So we get to school, and the bus like stops in front of the school, and up in the upper tier parking lot, I see my dad's feet and David's feet like this facing each other. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm in trouble. And he came in and pulled me out of school. And he said, I don't know where we're going and I don't know what we're doing, but your mother has packed your bags and we're leaving and we're going to figure this out. And I was like, I was 13 years old and boy, my daddy was mad. And so we got in the car and ended up driving to Florida. Now, at that time, like he said, I didn't speak to him for 2 days. And I just remember driving in the car and we ended up in Florida at two kids who used to be in their youth group. They couldn't have been more than 22, 23 years old, and they had gotten married. And dang it, if he didn't leave me there, he left me there. He enrolled me in this little Christian school and left me there. And so while I was there, they were friends with Elizabeth Elliott. Have y'all ever heard of Elizabeth Elliott? Elizabeth Elliott is a writer. Her husband was Jim Elliott, and he was a missionary to the Auca Indians. They were trying to make contact with these Indians, and they finally made contact with them, and then they killed Jim Elliott and all the other people with him. And then Elizabeth Elliott went back to live with them and converted them all to Christianity and raised her daughter with them. Wow. And so she wrote a book called Through Gates of Splendor, and then there's all these Jim Elliott journals. He wrote a lot of those stories, and they were Wheaton College grads, and my parents became friends with them because Valerie's daughter was the pastor's wife in our town. And they said, what are we going to do with this wayward daughter? And she said, I'm on the board of the Stony Brook School in Long Island, New York, and you should send her there. So my parents then, at the end of that school year, took me to New York and dropped me off. And y'all, I looked out my window one morning and there were girls running around in skirts with sticks. And I was like, what are they doing out there? And then someone came up to me and said, do you want to go to the deli and get a bagel? And I thought they were talking a different language. Like, I honestly had no idea what they were talking about. Yeah. And so I was thrown into this school, which was an Episcopal Presbyterian based school, made, sort of, it was a similar to a British boarding school. And so I was there for 4 years. So, I mean, I was just plucked out of this crazy place, put in this, from a Baptist church into this Presbyterian Episcopal school. Mm-hmm. Then I went to a Catholic college. And wow. And at one time was at, and this is a long way around to get back to your point, but and then here in Wheaton, we went to the Christian Missionary Alliance Church, and now we're at the Wheaton Bible Church. And that ecumenical journey for me was wonderful, because now I would have to say I have such a wonderful experience worshiping in a Catholic church because of the liturgy. And I realize on some level, if you're really taking the Catholic liturgy serious and the processes that they go through, there is such a deep well of ability to really connect with the divine if you're not just going through the motions, right? Yep. So I agree with you. It's that sort of walk in faith that's been helpful to me. What do you think, Bowling?
I try not to think too much, but no, no, I do agree entirely. I think exactly what you're saying, like how deep that each part of the Mass can be is really beautiful. And our pastor actually was going through that here recently, breaking down each piece. We've done some like theology on tap, but over Zoom. So I guess it's not exactly the same, but that's what that has been our ongoing topic. And yeah, it's great to listen to.
Yeah. Skye Jethani, during this whole COVID situation, introduced me to Good Shepherd, New York. Have you guys ever heard of their church service? Do you know the band Gungor? Mm-hmm. So the Gungor brothers, both of them are in music, and we had one of them on our podcast, David, I think it was, and he leads worship at the Good Shepherd New York church. And they've been doing, these online worship services, and it's very liturgical in the sense they even do communion. And I just love it. Like, it's super rich when you embrace that and get all that you can out of it.
Yeah, the one big thing that I changed my view on over the past 10 years is the real presence of Christ in the communion. I definitely am a believer of that now, and just getting to witness that in an Episcopal service on Sunday is amazing to me. I miss it because I don't do much of that anymore. But
yeah.
I really like the point too that you were making about like, going through the motions type thing, because like before I was Catholic, I was raised in a Baptist church, but before I was Catholic, that's just how I saw everybody doing that. Everybody's just going through the motions. Nobody's actually, like putting any thought into it at all. But you can do that. Sure. Yeah, you can go, but you can go through the motions anywhere. This is kind of what we were talking about, a little bit earlier. Like we're basically just, you can absorb what you were taught as a child and just do that without actually growing anywhere. And so like, it's possible to go through the motions no matter where you're at.
That's so true. I mean, that's exactly what I have discovered, is that there's this whole in the Protestant faith, it has become almost like a country club where everybody looks the same, talks the same, goes for social things. And it's just a matter of going to church on Sunday morning, going to Sunday school, being in a small group. And if you do that, you're a good Christian. Or if you there's all these things where you're a Christian, or you have a Christian marriage if it looks like this. And that is no different, honestly, than the Pharisees. I mean, our modern day, legalism can happen in a Catholic church, or it can happen in a, any sort of church, really, honestly. And it just, the rules and regulations and what's acceptable and what's not just change, and so I think we have to be careful, because truthfully, we can worship in just about any church if they are teaching the truth.
Mm-hmm.
If your relationship with Christ is, closely connected, and you're using that structure to draw you to the people around you and to draw you closer to Christ.
Yeah, so I think the pandemic has really shed a light on this, in that church and worship wasn't necessarily about connecting with the divine. It was about being with the people that we liked to be with, and the routine of that. So that has really challenged, I think, the local church, no matter the denomination, to really figure out what is it that we're really trying to accomplish here? How do we want to connect people? This is a conversation that I've had with folks over and over again during the pandemic, is how do you worship online? How do you worship when you don't have the things that you think about helping you worship?
Right.
So it's been an interesting process. And I think coming out of the pandemic, the local church really has to wrestle with that. And what are we doing as the local church? Are we connecting people with the divine? Are we helping people have a deeper relationship with Christ? Or are we just propagating institutions that we've done for years?
And that's what Skye Jethani has been talking about. I mean, and if your listeners have not read any of his stuff, I strongly suggest it. One of the first books he wrote was called Divine Commodity. And, he really has been challenging this whole engine of how the church has become commodified, and how really, we just have to think beyond these systems that we have put in place. He even talks about how wrong we are to have these, he would never say that, but we focus too much on the pastor-centric Sundays, right? Where it's either about just going for the sermon and your friends, and sometimes when I was a young mom, it's just to put my kids into Sunday school or whatever and get that break. But we're going for all the wrong reasons. And that is one thing that those liturgical services sort of break you out of, in that it does, it's not so much focused on the pastor and his sermon. There is so much more there for you to learn and connect with Christ.
Yeah, it's typically in the middle of the service instead of the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had this kind of unique dynamic where we've been live streaming services. And so we've got some folks who want us to break that out, and on Monday, just put the music, and on Tuesday, just put the sermon, so they don't have to listen to the parts they don't want to be a part of. They just can cherry pick what they want to do.
Wow.
You're missing the point. Like,
I was naively thinking it was from a better spot, like, oh, I want to spread my worship across the whole week, not that I just want to listen to a piece of it.
And our metrics show that, and we've got great music. So you have this group of folks who drop off after the music, and then you've got a group of folks that come in when they think the music is ending to get the other part. And so it's interesting, maybe the sermons are just that good. I mean,
Sorry, folks, that's all the time we have for this week. But join us next week for the second half of our discussion with Christian, where we talk about her film The Girl Who Wore Freedom, and we also discuss a top 5 World War II movies. Also, you can check out Christian's social media pages and The Girl Who Wore Freedom pages in the show notes. See you next week, folks.